Someone close is draining spiritual life, and most people never notice until the damage is irreversible. The Bible documents this phenomenon repeatedly, not as theory but as warning, because proximity without discernment has destroyed more destinies than open opposition ever could. Judas sat at the same table as Jesus for 3 years. Delilah shared Samson's bed while plotting his downfall. Absalom was David's own son, yet orchestrated a rebellion that nearly cost him the kingdom. These were not strangers lurking in shadows. They were intimate connections, trusted voices, familiar faces that carried hidden agendas masked by affection and history. What makes this pattern so dangerous is its subtlety. There are no dramatic announcements, no obvious betrayals in the beginning, just a slow erosion of peace that most people dismiss as stress or personal weakness until the foundation crumbles beneath them. Scripture treats relational discernment as essential wisdom, not optional guidance. Proverbs chapter 13 verse 20 declares that, "Whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm." This is not metaphorical language. It is diagnostic reality. The company kept shapes destiny more powerfully than talent, effort, or even calling, because influence operates beneath conscious awareness, rewiring thoughts, redefining normal, and redirecting purpose through constant exposure. 1 Corinthians 15:33 warns that bad company corrupts good character, using a Greek term that suggests gradual decay rather than sudden destruction. The corrosion happens slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day the realization hits that strength has vanished, conviction has dulled, and the fire that once burned brightly now flickers weakly in the presence of those who were supposed to fan the flames. Understanding how this erosion occurs requires examining the mechanics of spiritual influence. Relationships function as either amplifiers or suppressors of divine purpose. Some connections elevate focus, sharpen clarity, and accelerate growth. Others create constant static, introducing confusion, planting doubt, and generating endless cycles of drama that consume energy meant for advancement. The distinction is not always obvious because misaligned relationships rarely announce their toxicity. Instead, they camouflage themselves in loyalty, hide behind shared history, and weaponize familiarity to maintain access long after their season has expired. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 establishes that there is a time for everything under heaven, including a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. Discernment reveals which season is active, but pride, guilt, and fear of loneliness often blind people to what the Spirit already knows. Consider how peace functions as the primary indicator of alignment. Colossians chapter 3 verse 15 instructs believers to let the peace of Christ rule in their hearts, using a Greek word that means to act as umpire or arbitrator. Peace is not merely an emotion. It is a spiritual referee that signals whether something belongs in the game or needs to be benched. When peace consistently withdraws in specific relational contexts, that departure carries meaning. The mind will scramble to explain it away, blaming fatigue, circumstances, or personal insecurity. But the Spirit recognizes truth that logic resists. There are people whose presence disrupts internal equilibrium without committing any obvious offense. Conversations seem fine on the surface, but afterward there is residue, a lingering unease that refuses to settle no matter how much rationalization is applied. That residue is not paranoia. It is revelation. Biblical history demonstrates this principle through vivid accounts. Abraham had to separate from Lot in Genesis chapter 13, not because Lot was evil, but because their combined presence created conflict that hindered both destinies. The land could not support them dwelling together, and strife arose between their herdsmen. Abraham recognized that proximity without peace produces friction, So he offered Lot first choice of territory and created necessary distance. This was not rejection, it was wisdom. Sometimes the most loving action is releasing what cannot coexist peacefully, even when affection remains intact. The separation allowed both men to fulfill their respective callings without constant tension, draining their resources and attention. David's relationship with Saul illustrates how misalignment can exist even within God-ordained connections. Saul was anointed king. David served him faithfully, yet 1 Samuel chapter 18 records that an evil spirit from the Lord tormented Saul, and he repeatedly tried to kill David despite David's loyalty and success. David did not retaliate. He did not launch a smear campaign. He simply created distance, fleeing to the wilderness and maintaining respect for Saul's position while refusing to remain in harm's way. David understood that honoring someone's role does not require tolerating their dysfunction. Respect and proximity are not synonymous. Wisdom knows when to step back without bitterness, trusting God to vindicate rather than seeking personal revenge. The Apostle Paul confronted Peter publicly in Galatians chapter 2 when Peter's behavior contradicted the gospel they preached. Peter had been eating with Gentile believers until certain men from James arrived, at which point Peter withdrew and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. Paul opposed him to his face because the truth of the gospel was at stake. This was not personal attack. It was principled confrontation. Paul valued alignment over comfort, truth over social harmony, and spiritual integrity over relational ease. The account demonstrates that godly relationships prioritize correction over coddling, challenging each other toward truth rather than enabling compromise for the sake of artificial peace. Samson's downfall in Judges chapter 16 reveals how gradual influence erodes strength through repeated compromise. Delilah asked the source of his strength 4 separate times. Each time Samson gave a false answer. Each time she tested his words and discovered the lie. Each time he moved closer to revealing the truth until finally he told her everything, and she called the Philistines who shaved his head while he slept. The tragedy is captured in verse 20 where scripture records that Samson woke and said he would go out as before and shake himself free. But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. The loss was not sudden, it was cumulative. Each compromise seemed manageable in isolation, but the combined effect was catastrophic. He normalized betrayal until it felt like intimacy, and by the time he recognized the danger, his strength was already gone. Right here, in the midst of examining these patterns, there is an opportunity to pause and engage internally. A simple declaration such as "Lord, grant discernment" is not ritualistic repetition. It is intentional alignment, positioning the heart to receive clarity rather than defend comfort. Discernment requires humility, because it exposes what pride wants to protect. It demands courage because seeing truth creates responsibility to act on it. This moment of engagement shifts perspective from passive observation to active participation in spiritual development. The disconnect between words and actions serves as another critical indicator of misalignment. Matthew chapter 7 verse 16 reminds that people are known by their fruits, not their claims. Grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor figs from thistles. Yet countless relationships persist despite chronic inconsistency between verbal commitment and demonstrated behavior. Someone can speak encouragement while subtly undermining confidence. They can offer support publicly while questioning motives privately. They can celebrate victories verbally while harboring resentment internally. This disconnect creates exhausting mental gymnastics because every interaction becomes a puzzle to decode, every statement subject to scrutiny, every gesture analyzed for hidden meaning. James chapter 3 describes the tongue as a restless evil, full of deadly poison, capable of blessing God and cursing people made in his likeness. When someone's words consistently contradict their actions, discernment is being refined. God allows these contradictions to become visible over time, creating patterns too obvious to ignore. Repetition is instructional. It teaches what could have been dismissed as isolated incidents. Spiritual influence operates beneath conscious awareness, which is precisely what makes it so effective. When prayer life weakens in specific relational contexts, when conviction dulls in certain company, when spiritual sensitivity fades around particular people, those changes are symptomatic rather than coincidental. Godly relationships challenge without compromising devotion. They confront without diminishing passion for truth. They push toward growth rather than pull toward complacency. When the opposite occurs, when spiritual disciplines become optional, when accountability feels like judgment, when biblical conviction is reframed as legalism or extremism, influence is at work, and not the kind that aligns with divine purpose. Proverbs chapter 27 verse 17 declares that iron sharpens iron, and one person sharpens another. Sharpening involves friction, but friction with purpose produces an edge. Friction without purpose simply wears down the blade. Joseph's narrative in Genesis chapter 37 through 50 demonstrates how God sometimes uses relational betrayal to position people for greater purpose. His brothers hated him because of his dreams and their father's favoritism. They sold him into slavery, faking his death and devastating Jacob. Yet that betrayal initiated a sequence of events that eventually placed Joseph as second in command in Egypt, positioned to save nations from famine, including his own family. Genesis chapter 50 verse 20 records his perspective that what his brothers meant for evil, God intended for good, to bring about the present result of preserving many people alive. The betrayal was real. The injustice was painful. The years of suffering were not imaginary, but the outcome was redemptive. Sometimes God allows relational disruption not as punishment but as redirection, removing people from environments that would limit them to position them for assignments that require isolation and dependence on divine guidance alone. The principle of necessary separation appears throughout Scripture, not as failure, but as strategic repositioning. Ruth chose to leave Moab and cleave to Naomi, while Orpah returned home. Both decisions were valid, but they led to drastically different destinies. Ruth's choice placed her in the lineage of Jesus Christ, documented in Matthew chapter 1. Barnabas and Paul separated over disagreement about John Mark in Acts chapter 15. The contention was so sharp they parted company, with Barnabas taking Mark to Cyprus and Paul choosing Silas for his missionary journey. Both teams continued effective ministry in different directions. The separation was not evidence of spiritual failure. It was acknowledgement that alignment matters, and forcing unity where vision diverges produces inferior results compared to allowing each party to pursue their calling without compromise. God's warnings rarely arrive through single dramatic revelations. Instead, they emerge through persistent layered communication designed to break through resistance. An uneasy feeling surfaces during prayer. A trusted friend offers unsolicited insight that mirrors internal concerns. A passage of Scripture leaps off the page with startling relevance. A sermon addresses the exact situation being navigated. A song lyric captures the unspoken tension. A dream lingers longer than usual, carrying themes too specific to dismiss. These are not coincidences, they are confirmations. Multiple channels reinforcing the same message until acknowledgement becomes unavoidable. Proverbs chapter 3 verse 5 instructs believers to trust the Lord with all their heart and lean not on their own understanding, because human reasoning often defends what divine wisdom exposes. Ignoring repeated warnings does not make them less true. It only delays the inevitable confrontation with reality and increases the cost of eventual obedience. Stagnation within specific relational dynamics signals misalignment even when no obvious conflict exists. Growth is meant to be progressive, though not always comfortable. When development consistently halts around certain people, when the same issues resurface without resolution, when conversations loop endlessly without breakthrough, alignment is lacking. Hebrews chapter 12 verse 1 encourages laying aside every weight and sin that clings so closely, distinguishing between what is sinful and what is simply heavy. Not every hindrance is immoral, but every hindrance affects pace. Some relationships are not evil. They are just exhausting. They do not produce obvious harm, but they drain energy that could fuel advancement. Discernment recognizes when endurance becomes stubbornness and when loyalty transforms into bondage. Releasing what hinders is not betrayal. It is stewardship of divine assignment. Consider the analogy of a gardener tending a vineyard. John chapter 15 describes Jesus as the true vine and his Father as the vine dresser. Every branch in him that does not bear fruit is taken away, and every branch that does bear fruit is pruned so that it may bear more fruit. The removal is not vengeful, it is purposeful, protecting the health of the whole plant. Branches that do not produce drain resources from those that do. The gardener's goal is maximum fruitfulness, which sometimes requires strategic cutting. Relationships function similarly. Some connections produce growth, accountability, encouragement, and spiritual momentum. Others drain energy, create confusion, stir doubt, and hinder progress. Discernment allows recognition without resentment. It enables release without bitterness, understanding that pruning is evidence of care rather than rejection. Jesus himself modeled selectivity in relationships. Mark chapter 3 records that he appointed 12 to be with him and to be sent out to preach. From the crowds that followed him, he chose 12 for closer proximity. From the 12, he selected Peter, James, and John for even more intimate access, bringing them to the Mount of Transfiguration and the Garden of Gethsemane. John chapter 2 verse 24 states that Jesus did not entrust himself to people because he knew what was in man. This was not coldness, it was wisdom. Love and boundaries coexist. Compassion and discernment are not opposites. They are companions. Jesus extended ministry broadly but reserved intimate access selectively, understanding that not everyone who follows is meant to lead, and not everyone who listens is meant to counsel. The progression from awareness to action is where most people stall. Knowing something needs to change and actually implementing that change are vastly different experiences. Fear of conflict paralyzes. Guilt over disappointing others manipulates. Anxiety about being misunderstood intimidates. All of these barriers rise up to defend the status quo, but clinging to what God is releasing guarantees prolonged discomfort. Obedience might feel difficult initially, but disobedience ensures extended struggle. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 reiterates that there is a season for every purpose under heaven, and discernment reveals which season is present. Trying to force a relationship to continue beyond its divine expiration date produces frustration for everyone involved, delaying the next chapter God is trying to open. Recognizing misalignment does not require dramatic confrontation or public announcement. Sometimes it simply requires adjusting proximity. Not every relationship ends. Some just need redefinition. Boundaries can be established without lengthy explanation. Distance can be created without formal declaration. Wisdom does not demand public pronouncements. It operates quietly, strategically, and intentionally. Proverbs chapter 4 verse 23 commands guarding the heart above all else, for everything flows from it. Guarding is an active verb requiring vigilance, intentionality, and courage to prioritize spiritual health over social comfort. The heart is the wellspring of life, and protecting its purity determines the quality of everything that flows outward. Nehemiah chapter 6 provides powerful illustration of this principle. While rebuilding Jerusalem's walls, Nehemiah faced repeated attempts at distraction. Sanballat and Geshem sent messengers inviting him to meet in the villages of the Ono Valley, but Nehemiah perceived they intended harm. 4 times they sent the same message. 4 times Nehemiah responded that he was doing a great work and could not come down, asking why the work should stop while he left it to come to them. He recognized that not every invitation deserves acceptance, not every conversation merits participation, and not every relationship requires maintenance. His focus remained on assignment rather than approval, on divine mandate rather than human expectation. The walls were completed because Nehemiah refused distraction disguised as dialogue. Biblical wisdom consistently emphasizes that companionship shapes character more powerfully than circumstances. Proverbs chapter 22 verse 24 warns against making friends with a hot-tempered person or associating with one easily angered, explaining that such patterns become learned and lead to personal entrapment. Anger is contagious. Negativity spreads. Compromise multiplies. What begins as tolerance gradually evolves into participation. The frog placed in boiling water jumps out immediately, but the frog placed in cool water that slowly heats does not perceive the danger until escape becomes impossible. Gradual influence is exponentially more dangerous than sudden assault because it bypasses conscious defenses and rewires perception before awareness can intervene. David's Psalms repeatedly reference betrayal by close companions. Psalm 41 verse 9 laments that even a close friend in whom trust was placed, who ate bread with him, has lifted his heel against him. Psalm 55 verses 12 through 14 express that if an enemy were insulting, it could be endured, but it was a companion, a close friend, with whom sweet fellowship was shared, walking together to the house of God. The pain of intimate betrayal exceeds the harm of distant opposition because proximity creates vulnerability. David understood this reality through lived experience, yet he continued to trust God rather than becoming permanently guarded. He processed betrayal through worship rather than allowing it to produce bitterness, demonstrating that hurt does not require hardening and disappointment does not demand cynicism. The narrative of Elijah and Elisha in 2 Kings chapter 2 illustrates healthy relational progression and necessary separation. Elijah knew his time was ending. Elisha refused to leave him, following from Gilgal to Bethel to Jericho to the Jordan. When Elijah was taken up in the whirlwind, Elisha tore his own clothes, took up Elijah's cloak, and returned to strike the Jordan's waters, which parted just as they had for Elijah. The relationship had fulfilled its purpose. Elisha received double portion of Elijah's spirit, not by clinging indefinitely, but by honoring the season and stepping into his own calling when transition arrived. Some relationships are designed to prepare, equip, and then release. Trying to extend them beyond their divine duration stunts growth for both parties. Understanding these principles transforms how relational tension is interpreted. Not every conflict indicates incompatibility. Not every disagreement signals misalignment. But patterns reveal truth that isolated incidents obscure. When peace withdraws repeatedly in specific contexts, when spiritual vitality dims around certain people, when growth stagnates within particular dynamics, when words consistently contradict actions, when warnings multiply through various channels, discernment is speaking and wisdom demands response. God's guidance is not meant to isolate, but to align, not to create fear, but to establish clarity. Protection is an expression of love rather than evidence of loss. The decision to honor discernment and act on divine prompting requires courage that transcends human comfort. It means valuing spiritual health over social harmony, prioritizing divine assignment over human approval, and trusting God's perspective over personal perception. 2 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 14 asks what partnership righteousness has with lawlessness, what fellowship light has with darkness, establishing that some connections fundamentally cannot coexist without compromise. This is not license for judgmental isolation. It is recognition that alignment matters, that influence is real, and that stewarding divine purpose sometimes requires difficult relational adjustments that appear harsh to those who prioritize sentiment over calling. Reflection on these patterns invites movement from passive observation to active stewardship. Relationships are not accidents. They are assignments, and not every assignment is permanent. Some people are companions for a season, providing exactly what is needed during a specific chapter before both parties move forward separately. Recognizing when a season has concluded requires humility to admit what once worked no longer does, and courage to act on that realization despite discomfort. God's warnings are protective rather than punitive, designed to preserve purpose rather than create fear. When discernment surfaces, it arrives with intention, inviting alignment rather than demanding perfection. The goal is never isolation but clarity, never rejection but redirection, never judgment but wisdom that protects what God is building internally while releasing what hinders its full expression.